Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister guarantee to the House that he's leading a majority government that meets all of the requirements of the Constitution?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes.
The member for Gilmore. Members on my left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's policies are growing the economy, generating jobs, reducing cost of living pressures for households and businesses? Is the Prime Minister aware of any challenges that will damage the government's strategy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows very well that the people of her electorate are determined to see the government deliver on its commitments, and that is what we are doing. We are delivering while the opposition is seeking to obstruct the passage of legislation through this parliament consistent with our promises. Our focus has been making the 45th parliament work. Jobs, wages, electricity and gas prices, tackling the cost of living for households, families and businesses. Those are the issues that matter most to Australians, and that is our focus. Now, the Labor Party, of course, has sought to create dysfunction, try to create the impression of disorder, constantly standing in the way, abandoning the issues that matter to so many Australians. But you know, Mr. Speaker, they have been remarkably unsuccessful. Their attempts to block us from delivering one important reform after another have failed. We've worked with the Senate crossbench and the independents in this House to deliver on our agenda, to deliver on the promises that we made, because that's what matters to the Australian people, and I want to thank them for their continued cooperation. We've reduced the rate of company tax for millions of small and medium businesses, a measure that puts money back into the pockets of workers and grows the economy more than $17 billion every single year when it is fully implemented. Labor opposed this change, although advocated, including by the member for Maribyrnong, when they were in government. Now, instead of lower taxes, Labor wants to slug Australians with an extra $150 billion in higher taxes. They want higher taxes on Australians' pay packets. We've actually reduced income tax. They want higher taxes on homes, they want higher taxes on electricity, they want higher taxes on small and medium businesses and on investment. So despite talking about the need to protect workers, Labor voted against our corrupting benefits legislation and in so doing endorsed secret and corrupt payments between big business and big unions. Payments that have been used, as we know from the Hayden Royal Commission, to trade away workers' pay and conditions again and again. And they opposed the restoration of the rule of law to the construction sector. They opposed the Registered Organisation Commission, which will require unions to be accountable to their members. They talked endlessly about the importance of needs-based funding for schools, but they voted against the first comprehensive delivery of national, transparent, consistent needs-based funding for schools endorsed by David Gonski. They called for reform to childcare and then voted against it. The Labor Party has no consistency, no integrity, no loyalty to the Australian people.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer to my question. Why then did the government refer the Deputy Prime Minister to the High Court?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've answered that question on several occasions this week, and I refer the honourable member to those previous answers.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister advise the House of the importance of upholding the non-interference in the domestic political affairs of other nations principle?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs will stay in her seat. Members on my left. interjected right through that question. I'm going to ask the member to repeat it. And if I hear any more interjections from the member for McMahon like incoming, he'll be outgoing. The member for Berowra has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister advise the House of the importance of upholding the principle of non-interference in the domestic political affairs of other nations?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs. The member for Sydney is warned. The member for McEwen will leave under 94A.
You'll get him thrown out. You haven't said
Okay. Before we move on, anyone want to join him? The Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Berowra for his question. Let me be very clear. The Australian Labor Party's conduct in orchestrating for a New Zealand member of the Labor Party to ask a question in the New Zealand Parliament designed to undermine the Australian
The member for
Deputy
Sydney
Prime
has been
Minister
warned. It's a final
is not
warning.
only highly improper, it is in direct breach of the international obligation for non-interference. Mr Speaker, Labor have now been well and truly caught out. Senator Penny Wong's Chief of Staff instigated a situation where the Labor Member of Parliament in New Zealand was directed to ask questions about the Deputy Prime Minister, and the member for Grainler let the cat out of the bag today when he said on morning radio that the Deputy Prime Minister's name was raised in the conversation. Of course, he's been monstered now, but he let the cat out of the bag. Now, Mr Speaker, that means that the Labor Party are misleading the Australian people, and New Zealand Labor, no less, have judged what they were asked to do by the Australian Labor Party as inappropriate, unacceptable, wrong, and should not have happened. And, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have also misled the Australian people by claiming that it was only questions from Fairfax Media to the New Zealand government that sparked this incident. Not so, according to the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, who has said that it was in fact the questions from the New Zealand Labor member at the instigation of Labor that sparked the entire incident. As the New Zealand media are reporting, the New Zealand government is under no obligation to answer questions from the Australian media, but as soon as those questions were put on notice in the New Zealand Parliament, the New Zealand government had an obligation, a legal obligation to answer. So the Australian Labor Party set up the New Zealand government. As Prime Minister Bill English said, these are serious issues, and there were significant misjudgments by the New Zealand Labor Party about urging them to interfere in the Australian political process. As the New Zealand Foreign Minister said, this is extraordinary, unprecedented behaviour to seek to invoke the New Zealand Parliament. And as New Zealand Labor have condemned Labor in Australia, unacceptable, inappropriate, wrong behaviour, it should never have happened. Labor stands condemned.
Members on my left, Manager Opposition Business can just pause for a second. The members for Solomon, Newcastle, Gellibrand, Lindsay I mentioned, numerous others, will cease interjecting or they'll leave the chamber rapidly. Question time is for the parliament and for the public, and I won't tolerate a wall of noise through the answers of ministers. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Would the Minister for Foreign Affairs please tell the House some more about the evil, treacherous, treasonous international conspiracy that she has exposed in this House time and again?
Minister for Foreign Affairs will resume her seat. The member for Eden Monero can leave under 94A. The Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call.
Mr Speaker, the hubris of the Australian Labor Party on this issue is extraordinary. Apparently, the Labor Party believes that they are above the law. There's one rule for the Labor Party and one rule for the rest of Australia.
Members on my left.
Craig Thompson was allowed to sit in this parliament when he was in clear breach of the law. The Leader of the Opposition condones the lawlessness of his unions. The Labor Party have breached the most fundamental international principle and they laugh about it. Prime Minister Bill English said in the New Zealand Parliament yesterday that these were serious issues where the Labor Party had set up the New Zealand Labor Party to undertake a series of actions that the Labor Party in New Zealand have now admitted were wrong, inappropriate, unacceptable and should not have happened, and it was all at the behest of the Australian Labor Party, who stop at nothing, will trash any principle, trash any promise, trash any element of decency in order to gain a political advantage. This is a significant and serious issue, as the New Zealand Prime Minister has pointed out. And for Labor to find it amusing that Senator Wong, who holds herself out to be the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, would direct her Chief of Staff to contact a sitting member of another parliament to use another parliament as a platform to launch an attack on the Australian Deputy Prime Minister is an utter disgrace.
Absolute disgrace.
And the New Zealand Prime Minister was asked whether he thought I was correct in raising this issue. And the New Zealand Foreign Minister said it's a perfectly reasonable reaction given the fact that a New Zealand Member of Parliament from the New Zealand Labor Party, under the influence from the Australian Labor Party, is asking questions clearly designed to remove a government member in Australia. That is the bigger problem here. And, Mr Speaker, it behoves the Labor Party, not at all well, for them to trivialise what is a serious issue. The New Zealand Prime Minister says it's a serious issue. The New Zealand Foreign Minister says it's a serious issue. The New Zealand Labor Party are furious that they were conned into unacceptable, inappropriate behaviour that was wrong and should never have happened. Shame, Labor.
Just before I call the member for Melbourne, whose question it is next, I'm not going to keep repeating myself about the level of noise. Members know precisely what they're doing. I will take more severe action if necessary. If members are going to behave in this fashion, frankly, they're snubbing their nose at the parliament, and I'm not going to put up with it. The member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. I do have a question very briefly on indulgence. I congratulate the Greens leadership of the Yarra Council in my electorate for doing something that will make a difference to the lives
the member
of
for
Aboriginal
Melbourne will come to his question or
Melbourne.
resume his seat.
My question's to the Prime Minister. During a recent debate about coal, climate change and the Great Barrier Reef in this chamber, one of your backbenchers, the member for Flynn, stated, and I quote from Hansard, "There's nothing wrong with the reef. I live on the reef." Will you condemn this assessment, or is it now the government's official position? Is this why you're happy for the Deputy Prime Minister to bankroll the Adani coal mine and make global warming worse, using the drug dealers' defence that if we don't give other countries our products, someone else will? And with Adani now under investigation for fraudulently siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars into offshore tax havens, why are you leaving a legally questionable minister in charge of giving a legally questionable company $1 billion of taxpayers' money?
Just before I call the Minister for Health and Sport, I'll just remind the member for Melbourne that you seek indulgence. You don't simply just take it. But I'll be lenient on this occasion. Certainly not the worst bit of behaviour in the House today. The Minister for Health and Sport, representing the Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I am delighted to take this question from the Greens today. because they sat there when they were in a partnership with a Labor government which saw the reef placed on the World Heritage in Danger Watch list. They sat there and did nothing. So when we came to government, the reef was on the watch list, and they were silent, they were complicit, they were inactive, they were passive, and they were part of a monumental failure of environmental policy on that side of the House. And I'm just warming up. And what happened on our watch? The reef was taken off the World Heritage Watch list. And what did the head of the World Heritage Committee say? They said that Australia, under our watch, was a role model to the world, Minister Maria Böhmer of Germany, as to how to manage a World Heritage property. And why would that be? One, because we inherited 5 major dredge disposal projects in that reef, and we ended them all. We banned dredge disposal, capital dredge disposal in the Barrier Reef, which had been a practice for over 100 years, right through the Greens partnership with the ALP. Silence, inaction and passivity on behalf not just of the Greens but on behalf of their beloved ALP. These two parties are tied at the hip and they are environmental frauds. You hear that? Environmental frauds. They had their chance. They had 6 long, painful years and did nothing. We went a lot further, though. We put $210 million into the Reef Trust. We're part of a $2 billion investment in the reef over the coming 10 years, and we also, and this Prime Minister announced, a $1 billion reef fund in the lead-up to the election, which is now being put in place. That's what we did. That's why the World Heritage Committee took us off the watch list, took Australia off the watch list for our management of the reef on our watch, but they put the reef on the watch list under Labor and under the Greens. At the end of the day, Labor and the Greens are environmental frauds and they failed on the reef.
The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on the benefits of a strong and consistent border protection measures? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question and his genuine interest in, like all members on this side of the parliament, making sure that we keep our borders strong. So thank you very much to the member for Tangi. Now, this was a big election issue at the last election, the one before that, Mr Speaker, because to all Australians, particularly in the modern age, people recognise that we have to have strong borders. We cannot have people arriving without documentation, without any story about what country they've come from, the circumstances in which they've come. And this country has been very poorly served over a long period of time by Labor governments that have undone successful policies in protecting our borders and allowing people to arrive here in the tens of thousands. We know, Mr Speaker, for example, that when Labor came into government in 2007, there were only 4 people in detention, including no children, and yet under Labor's watch, when they dismantled the successful Liberal government policies of the Howard government, there were 50,000 people who came on 800 boats. There were 8,000 children put into detention, to the great shame of the Labor-Green alliance, and there were 1,200 people who drowned at sea. I'm pleased to inform the House today, Mr Speaker, that it's 1,116 days today since we've had a successful people smuggling operation. We have turned back, as part of Operation Sovereign Borders, 31 boats, and we have not had any deaths at sea, as I say, and it is one of the crowning achievements of this government. And, Mr Speaker, when you look at the Leader of the Opposition, you wonder why people don't believe him when it comes to this very issue. Why do people say, I don't think this Leader of the Opposition is genuine when he says that they will continue the policies of this government if they are elected at the next election? I'll tell you why they don't believe this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, why they find that he is not a genuine person when it comes to the issue of border protection. That is because when he was a leader within the union movement, he donated $100,000 to the Get Up movement. He can't find any documentation. He can't find approval for the donation. It comes on top of $1 million that was donated by the CFMEU to GetUp. Now, what does GetUp believe in? GetUp believes in dismantling Operation Sovereign Borders. The GetUp movement is a front for the Labor and Green movements in this country, and yet the Leader of the Opposition is saying to the Australian public that he's tough on borders. At the same time, he's donating money to GetUp, who is absolutely committed to dismantling our policies. So if the Australian public at the moment, Mr Speaker, is asking themselves why in their heart of hearts do they believe that this Leader of the Opposition is duplicitous and he can't be trusted, don't look at this man's words, look at his actions, because his actions over his working life have demonstrated that he is untrustworthy. He's been involved in every dodgy deal that his union was a party to, and he is misrepresenting the Labor Party's position at the moment because all of those behind him, as well as GetUp, do not believe in the tough border protection policy.
The member for Isaacs will just resume his seat for a second. I'm pleased to inform the House we have joining us today in the chamber a delegation from the Parliament of Uruguay, led by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr José Carlos Maia. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you and to your delegation. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Yesterday, the Foreign Minister refused to accept that the Conservative New Zealand Internal Affairs Minister was telling the truth when he said it was media inquiries that prompted New Zealand's response to the Deputy Prime Minister's citizenship. On what basis did the Foreign Minister call the New Zealand Internal Affairs Minister a liar?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call.
Mr Speaker, my understanding of the timeline, as backed up by the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, is that it was the questions put on notice and raised in the New Zealand Parliament that sparked the New Zealand government to act, because the questions from the Fairfax media, in fact, do not give rise to an obligation on the part of the New Zealand government to answer it. Correct. But as Senator Wong well knew, as her Chief of Staff well knew, it was raising questions in the Parliament that put an obligation on the New Zealand government to act. And the New Zealand Foreign Minister has said that it was the questions on notice, the questions in the Parliament, that sparked this incident, not the questions from the Australian media.
The member for Sydney. The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the minister outline to the House why it is important that leaders of unions and employer organisations always act in the best interests of their members? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Forrest for her question. And the member for Forrest might like to know that the Leader of the Opposition has in fact been referred to the Registered Organisations Commission for his failure to provide evidence over the $100,000 donation that he gave to GetUp in 2005 in start-up capital that was not necessarily done so in accordance with Rule 57 of the AWU in getting proper authorisation. Now, if the Leader of the Opposition had nothing to hide, Mr Speaker, those minutes would have been produced, which show that the necessary motions were passed. The Leader of the Opposition has yet again adopted the tactic that he always adopts, which is to simply stonewall anything unpleasant about whether it's the union movement when he was the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, the donations that he received from companies like Unibuilt and Australian Super when he was the candidate for Maribyrnong, Mr Speaker. There's quite a charge sheet when it comes to the Leader of the Opposition not providing evidence to back up the assertions that he makes. And yet again, we see him being tricky and sneaky with the issue of undermining the relationship between Australia and New Zealand, a very important relationship, Mr Speaker. Until yesterday, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party were trying to pretend that they knew virtually nothing about what was going on in New Zealand with the questions that were being asked by the New Zealand Labor MP. They were trying to pretend these stories had come out of the Fairfax media. Then we discovered, Mr Speaker, last night Senator Wong tried to get the story out as late as possible in the day that, in fact, her Chief of Staff had been the person who had initiated the questions in the New Zealand Parliament. And today, the member for Grayndler confirmed that far from these being general questions about New Zealand citizenship rules, the conversation was about the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. Quite specifically, he said so on 5AA radio this morning and a show with me, Mr Speaker. We discovered, in fact, that it was the Chief of Staff to the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs who was going through the bins in New Zealand, turning over leaves and rocks, looking for dirt on the Deputy Prime Minister. And that the Foreign Minister is absolutely right. This is a very serious matter, Mr Speaker. What the Australian Labor Party has been prepared to do is work with an opposition party in a foreign power in New Zealand to undermine the Australian government. Now, you hear all their faux laughter, led by the member for Isaacs, that's his job as the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business. But actually, this is a serious matter, and the Leader of the Opposition has to answer for it. The Leader of the Labor Party in New Zealand understands it. She said it was inappropriate conduct. Why isn't our Leader of the Opposition here strong enough to say the same thing?
The Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and it goes to the extraordinary conspiracy theories the government is advancing in the House as to why Labor is to blame for the government's crisis. Which of the following are Labor's fault? Is it Labor's fault the Leader of the House moved a motion on Monday to refer the Deputy Prime Minister to the High Court? Is it Labor's fault—
Can the Manager of Opposition Business resume his seat for a second? The member for Goldstein is preventing me hearing the question. He's warned. I've warned him a number of times. You know exactly what the next step is. The member for— that was a member for Wakefield, a very familiar voice. You're warned too. Okay. The Manager of Opposition Business will begin his question again.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it goes to the extraordinary conspiracy theories the government is advancing as to why Labor is to blame for the government's crisis. Which of the following are Labor's fault? Is it Labor's fault the Leader of the House moved a motion on Monday to refer the Deputy Prime Minister to the High Court? Is it Labor's fault his deputy yesterday admitted he was a citizen of the foreign power right up until the weekend? Or is it Labor's fault that his deputy's father was born in New Zealand in 1924?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
The standing orders are very clear about the responsibilities of the Prime Minister, and they don't go to the failures of the Labor Party.
The Leader of the House is right, and I suspect the Manager of Opposition Business knows that. The next question, the member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister inform the House how lower company tax rates will help grow the economy, create jobs and therefore assist Australians with their endeavour to get out of the welfare system and into work? And what are the alternative approaches?
Member for Rankin's been warned, so he can leave under 94A. The Minister for Social Services has the call. I remind members I'll take more severe action if they keep interjecting. The Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ford because he shares this view that the welfare goal for all governments is to create opportunity and improve individual lives by having more and more people each year moving off welfare and into work. And under 6 years of Labor, the year-on-year expenditure growth in unemployment benefits was an astonishing 13.5% per year. Under our government, the comparative figure has been 3.7% a year. And what that Labor figure represents, very sadly, was each year too many people going on to Newstart and too few people moving off the payment. And last financial year, our success has been underpinned by job creation. We've created 240,000 jobs last year. The government has decreased taxes for 3.2 million small businesses that employ 6.5 million Australians. But of course, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about alternatives. The alternative approach by members opposite is that the opposition wants to reverse tax cuts to small business. Mr Speaker, the formula is simple. Competitive business equals more jobs growth equals less welfare dependency. And in the past, the single greatest supporter of that common-sense policy proposition was the Leader of the Opposition.
And, Mr Speaker, we have found a very interesting speech. It took some digging, Mr Speaker, and in fact we thought the member for Lily's biography was hard to find, but this took some digging. This was truly a lost artefact. And in fact we went on to the Leader of the Opposition's website, and mysteriously the speech made days before this is there, available, clear and present. The speech made days after this is available there, clear and present. This mysteriously missing speech, Mr Speaker, took some digging. But we found it, members, in that big warehouse run by Indiana Jones, somewhere between the Ark of the Covenant and the Crystal Skull. We found it. We found the lost speech at ACOS, Mr Speaker, and no wonder it was so well hidden, because this is what it said. Reducing the corporate tax rate is an investment in the Australian people, including people who might now be on welfare. The Leader of the Opposition then specifically rejected an increase to the rate of Newstart, and what he says is, what that fails to recognise is that we need to better encourage employment, not greater welfare dependency. But it got even better, members, because the Leader of the Opposition then went on to give specific policy advice as to how to structure company tax cuts. He said lowering the corporate tax rate for smaller business only creates an artificial incentive for Australian businesses to downsize. He then finished with rhetorical flourish when he said, friends, corporate tax reform creates jobs right up and down the income ladder.
Has concluded. Members on my right. Members on my right. The member for Deakin, Leader of the House. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Foreign Minister. In her travels, the Foreign Minister has made it clear that she's able to have constructive meetings with the President of Iran, the President of Russia and the President of the Philippines. How can the Foreign Minister claim any credibility or bring any professionalism to her job if we're meant to believe she can work with Iran, Russia and the Philippines, but maybe not New Zealand?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call. Members on my left.
The capital of Africa.
The Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call.
Oh, really, Mr Speaker? This is a question from a Member of Parliament who called Ariel Sharon a war criminal and called the State of Israel a rogue state. She has no credibility whatsoever because she thinks Africa is a country. Not once, not twice, but 3 times she called Africa a country. What's the capital of Africa again? Mr Speaker, the fact is the New Zealand Labor leader has now distanced herself from the Australian Labor Party. She has said that what Labor was asked to do—
The Minister for Foreign Affairs doesn't have to resume her seat. She can just pause for a second. This won't take long. The member for Gellibrand, the member for Lindsay will leave under 94A. The Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call.
Mr Speaker,
the member for Sydney's been warned 3 times. She can leave under 94A. The member for Sydney will leave immediately under 94A. The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I know how sensitive the member for Sydney is to be reminded of her faux pas in Foreign Affairs when she was a shadow minister. It was so embarrassing she clearly had to be moved on. But, Mr Speaker, the fact is the New Zealand Labor Party leader has said that the incident in the New Zealand Parliament, indeed where the Australian Labor Party put them up to it, was wrong. It was unacceptable, it was inappropriate, and it should never have happened. So why doesn't the leader of the Labor Party in Australia admit that what they sought to do by putting the New Zealand Labor Party up to this stunt was wrong, inappropriate,
unacceptable and should never have happened. I accept, at her word, what the New Zealand Labor leader has said. What the Australian people should never accept is anything that comes out of the mouth of the Leader of the Opposition.
The Manager of Opposition Business can resume his seat for a second. Members think I'm not going to keep removing them from the chamber, or I won't take more severe action. They're sadly mistaken. I want them to know that if they continue to interject, they are determining they will be excluded from the chamber. The Manager of Opposition Business seeking to table the document. The member for Murray.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of the tourism industry to our economy and in creating jobs for hard-working Australians, especially those in regional communities? Is the Minister aware of any threats to our vital tourism industry?
The Minister for Tourism, Trade and Investment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Murray for his question about Australia's tourism industry, because Australia's tourism industry is flourishing under the coalition government. We've got a record number of tourists staying for a record length of time and spending a record amount of money, no doubt buoyed by the fact that as a coalition we are providing record funding for Tourism Australia. And we're doing so because we recognise the importance of Australia's tourism industry. It generated some $39.8 billion worth of export income over the 262 million nights that international tourists spent in Australia. And in particular, we're very focused on the benefits that flow to regional parts of Australia off the back of tourism. In fact, the member for Murray's electorate, Mr Speaker, some 3,029 people are employed directly in the tourism industry across some 1,500 tourism businesses. So we take tourism seriously, and the coalition recognises the value of this industry. But we do unfortunately see from time to time some threats not only to Australia's tourism industry but to tourism across the board. Right now, with 45 cents in every dollar of tourism spending going into regional parts of the country, we want to make sure that that continues. But when we look around the world, we do see threats. And in particular, Mr Speaker, we've seen in Europe the rise of some anti-tourism protests and others that have been taking place. We've seen examples of where extremist groups have actually been pushing for people to slash the tyres of tourism buses and to slash, for example, the bikes that tourists can hire as a pushback against tourism. Now, these have been labelled as extremist. But what we see in this country, Mr Speaker, are supportive measures that are made for these kinds of extreme protests. We've actually seen the head of the ACTU, Ged Kearney, tweeting in support of these protesters against the tourism industry. And the reason that's important, the reason why we need to be very aware of the impact of these extremist elements of the trade union movement is because the trade union movement basically owns the Australian Labor Party. There are 10 million reasons why the Australian Labor Party consistently listens to the views of the Australian union movement, and it's because they pay the bills. And we need to know that Australia's tourism industry simply won't be safe or protected if we see extreme examples of Australia's union movement supporting these kinds of activities against the tourism industry. We know fundamentally that the Leader of the Opposition says, as Labor leader, I still think like a union organiser. And we need to look no further than his activities as Leader of the Opposition to know about the character of this man. Because what we know, Mr Speaker, is that as Leader of the Opposition, he's done a whole range of things to sell out people to get ahead. He sold out Kevin Rudd. He sold out Julia Gillard. He's prepared to sell out the mining workers of Australia by taking money from the AWU. He'll sell out union members for Clean Event, and he'll sell out Australia's national interest to work with the New Zealand Labor Party.
Concluded. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Manager of Opposition Business from moving the following motion forthwith. That the House 1 notes that A. On Monday, this House unanimously asked the High Court to determine whether the Deputy Prime Minister is constitutionally qualified to be a Member of Parliament. B. On Tuesday, the Deputy Prime Minister admitted he had been a citizen of a foreign power right up until the weekend. C. former Minister Matt Canavan has resigned from Cabinet and will not vote in the Senate until the High Court resolves doubts about his constitutional qualifications to be a Member of Parliament. D. Yesterday, the Foreign Minister refused to accept that the Conservative New Zealand Internal Affairs Minister was telling the truth. And E. This morning on Sky News, the Foreign Minister refused to answer whether she could now work with the future New Zealand government. And 2. Therefore calls on the Prime Minister A. to stop trashing Australia's international relations in order to distract from the crisis that the government is facing, B. rule out accepting the vote of the Deputy Prime Minister while his constitutional qualifications are in doubt, and C. direct the Deputy Prime Minister to immediately resign from Cabinet. It is National Joke Day and they have delivered. We are watching
Manager
a
of Opposition
government,
Business
an
will resume
illegitimate
his
government.
seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
Speaker, there's only so much faux outrage I can put up with in 1 week. I therefore move the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved that the member be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. That the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is that the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I point the honourable members for Murray and Gray tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Morton and Lawler tell us for the noes. David. Order. The result of the division is ayes 72, no 64. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion, Mr Speaker. Barnaby Gate has now infected the whole
Leader
of this—
of the House has the call.
Mr Speaker, as much as we're enjoying the member for Hunter's contributions this week, I move the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the member for Hunter be no longer heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Appoint the same tellers as the previous division. It would be helpful if members were to remain in their places during this successive division unless they're leaving the chamber or they did not vote in the previous division or they're changing their votes, in which case they must report to the tellers. The member for McMahon needs to remain in his place unless he's changing his vote. I can read it out again. I read it out every single time. Lock the doors. The question is the member for Hunter be no further heard. Again, members need to remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 72, no 64. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The noes have it. Division required. We'll ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Morton. Tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Gray and Murray. Tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 61, noes 72. The question is therefore negative. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.